Welcome to Comms First. This session is called The Impact of COVID-19 on Microsoft Teams and Yammer Adoption. Our speaker today is Laurence Lockley. Laurence, welcome.
Thank you, Teresa. So, are we ready to go or
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. Okay, well, welcome to whoever's out there listening to this or maybe on the recording later on. So if COVID-19 isn't on your universe, it's definitely not number one, it's definitely number two. So it's a very popular topic and very popular for us as well. Just a little bit about what I'm looking to cover in this talk, a little bit about who we are, who's SWOOP Analytics and why do we care and why is it important to us. One of the things that SWOOP Analytics does is it benchmarks. It benchmarks Yammer, it benchmarks Teams and what other products we work with as well. And we benchmark in a quite unique way. We don't survey people, we actually measure what they do. So what the actual staff are actually interacting on, we take those measurements and we infer insights from that. We did a major study which really finished up, or this was launched just before the COVID period hit, and I'm going to go through some of those findings. But of course, with COVID, which really hit around the sort of March period of this year, that was about the transition month as we saw it, and then from April on, we've either been deeply in it or trying to transition back out or what have you. This has been a very rich learning period for us. So we've continued our benchmarking with selected clients that we have, looking at the way that Teams and Yammer have been used by these organisations. And finally, I want to follow up with a little bit of a future thought piece and thinking about, well, having seen what's been happening over the last few months and from the benchmarking that we've been doing with Teams and Yammer, where do we see this whole new digital office post-COVID-19 going? So I want to finish up with that. But firstly, let me just go into who are we? Who's SWOOP? So we're a startup. We're becoming a more mature startup now. We've been going 6 years now. So we started with our science. The science behind what we do is a science called social network analysis. And personally, I've been doing that sort of science for over 20 years now. And my colleague Kai Kerr, we got together in 2006, I think, to form a consulting company that just did projects on social network analysis. So we built up a lot of expertise on how to practically use the analytics that went with social network analysis. And then we formed SWOOP in 2014, actually, to spin out from our consulting company. And that was about the time when Yammer started to become used by the enterprise more comprehensively. So it could give us a picture, I guess, of how an organisation was interacting just through its digital interactions. So we started with Yammer in 2014. We added Workplace by Facebook a few years later, and then about 2 years ago, we sort of started doing Teams and especially the Teams channel area. So with that, we've collected a lot of data, and it's anonymous data actually, because we don't actually rely on the content of messages to develop our insights. We develop our insights purely from how people connect with each other. And so if someone broke into our databases, they'd see a lot of IDs connected to other IDs, but they won't see text of people's messages or names or what have you. So again, that's one of the advantages in using social network science. We don't need the content, we just need the connection. And of course, when we send that insight back to you, on your side of the firewall, we can add all the richness of the context back in. So you can see a little picture on the right of the screen. That's the sort of dashboard that we have. You can see on the bottom right, there's a network diagram. That's really the fundamentals of social network analysis. If you studied that, you will have seen networks like that. But we've been doing benchmark studies for Yammer clients for over 5 years now. We've got well over 100 companies in our benchmark database. We've just started doing Teams, and let's see. The most recent one, as I said, we launched the report, and the report is freely available from our website, which is on this slide. We looked at over 5,000 teams, 5,300 teams 47,000 active users. So people are actually doing something in Teams across 15 organisations. Now that's large actually by anybody's standards in terms of studying Teams. If we look at Teams that are being studied for what they actually do, the next largest study we found was something that IBM had done a few years ago with about 400 teams, and then Google did one with about 180 teams. So looking at what they're actually doing, the digital traces. So this is a big study by any measure. Here, the summary of the report is something nearly like 90 pages, so it's not something like you can read in 5 minutes. So I'm giving you a very quick overview here. We found that on average, staff were a member of 3 teams, but mostly active in 1. Now, some of you on the call might think, well, I've been using Teams and I'm in many more teams than that, you know. So, but when you look at the whole of organisations, so you know, rather than those that tend to be leading an area like Teams or Teams adoption, it does come out that, you know, most people are just in 1 and just active in 1. They could be member in more and what have you, but not. The vast majority of teams are private, and I guess you sort of expect that. And I guess having studied Yammer, which is nearly the opposite, you know, usually it's about 80-something% public. You know, there's quite a difference. So you can see that teams are being used for very local private activities compared to, say, something like Yammer. We see that Microsoft is positioning Microsoft Teams as a hub, and they were very interested in understanding how much is Teams actually being used as a hub. Well, we analysed that and we found that 70% of the team sites had actually added a tab to their default tabs. So they were actually starting to use Teams as a tab. We found that most of those tabs actually were for other Office products. In fact, the most popular one by far was Excel, you know, and then that was followed by SharePoint and Planner. So there were a few non-Microsoft tabs in the list, but the most common one was PDFs, if you like. So fairly modest, I guess, use of the hub at the moment, but clearly as time goes by, we'll be monitoring that and seeing how teams are actually bringing in richer software. In fact, even our own product SWOOP is potentially a tab, and we'll be watching that as well, how many people are adding SWOOP to their tab. We also found that Teams, the collaboration breadth is very much within the formal line of business. So you have a formal business structure. Often the teams were formed aligned with those formal structures. So whilst Teams obviously isn't restricted to that, in fact, it's encouraged to use Teams to cross the formal lines of business, we found that that isn't really happening that much. Of course, Yammer does that a lot better, and I'll talk a little bit about that later in some of the things we look at. The other big finding was that, you know, there were some exceptional teams, really high-performing teams. And I must say that when we do our benchmarking, we don't just sort of pull the numbers out and then report them. We actually look at the best performing teams in this case, and we go back to the client and would say, this is a team, we don't know its name, we do know its ID, if you like. We think this is a very high-performing team. We'd like to hear their story. And they go out and find this team, and without exception, they say, yeah, they're an exceptional team, this team, or group if it's Yammer and what have you. And then they would tell us the story, and we would publish that story. So our benchmarking reports don't only have analytics in them, but they have case studies and stories about the high-performing teams and groups and companies that are using this software. So in essence, we're drawing the insights from what people actually do, and then we're feeding back their stories through our benchmarking reports for the more qualitative sort of performance things that they've been doing and the practices that they've been adopting. So in essence, the benchmarking report doesn't only have numbers, but it has stories as well. And the other thing I might say about the numbers is that when you look at this number of teams, you get a good sense of what a reasonable target is for a measure, right? So we know what the best performance is. We know what the average performance is. Typically, we'll pick somewhere in between those and say, this is a good goal to aim for if you want to be good at what you're doing. So let's just drill a little bit more through this to some particular things. Oh, yes. Okay. So the other thing we noticed very quickly is that as people came to Teams, they tended to adopt just particular functions. Now, I might add, sometimes functions weren't even turned on when organisations were adopting Teams, but nevertheless, what we found was that people would gravitate to the parts of Teams that they felt that they knew they could, if you like, assimilate the easiest. And of course, chat, calls, meetings, those are things that really happened in Skype, or Skype for Business as it became, or even in email for that matter. The majority of organisations were using those tools. When they came into Teams, that's the functions within Teams that they tend to use. Now, the part we call that, and I've got this sort of beehive analogy for describing Teams, the part where the teams actually exist, and we were calling the land of teaming, is actually the team channels. And if you think about the team channels as the place that the team really lives, right, or should live, I might say. It's like the beehive, right? So that's where things and knowledge is brought back to sort of share and develop the product, if you like, which for bees is the honey, of course. Interestingly, we could see that people that are migrating from the Yammer, they might have had a team in Yammer, or they might have had teams in SharePoint. It was less of a bind for them to come in and start using the team channels. But if you're used to just using Skype for Business and email, it was much easier for you to come in and just use chat and calls. In fact, and what we found was, in terms of pure messages, 70–90% of all messages actually were in the chat space. We also found that of the teams, only 40% of the teams that have been forming were actually really active. A lot of them were experimental. So in essence, the hive part of Teams is really in the early days, and we're finding that the adoption of things like chat and calls and meetings within Teams, it's the easier adoption path. And in fact, during COVID, it's even accelerated more than the numbers you see here. So these were the numbers pre-COVID, and from our observations, most people, new people coming into Teams, are using it like Skype and meetings that they might have set up in Outlook. So which is a good thing because it gets them on the platform, but it's also a bad thing if that's all they end up doing. And as we said in the report, this is something that's coming out of the report, we said you can look at Teams as you can adopt it according to your risk profile, if you like. If you're purely looking at some efficiencies, using the digital parts of Teams, the calls, the chats, even setting up Teams just within your current structure, that's pretty easy. I think that's an easy, low risk way in. But if you want to get the full value out of Teams, you start to need to look at how you can use teaming. And I'm talking about teaming as a concept, about using real teams, as opposed to teams that just call teams inside your formal organisation. These are teams like project teams where they are formed to interact with each other rather than just to sit in a structure. And of course, you can adopt that for just a part of your organisation that are doing development projects. That's sort of more like building agile teams into your organisation, but leaving the business as usual parts as normal. And of course, you can go the whole hog and transform yourself to a total teaming organisation. I must say we haven't seen much of that. We've seen a little bit of the agility. The vast majority of organisations are in that efficiency stage at the moment. So what were the best teams? I said that we had some very high performing teams. When we looked at those high performing teams and we went back to our customers to find out what they were doing, we were able to then classify them into sort of best use cases for using Teams. And these are the use cases that we found that were most commonly high performing. So you can look at these as context where Teams is really going to add a lot of value quickly. And the first one was teams that were set up to monitor things around the clock and around the globe. We had a number of these teams that were incredibly active in the Teams channel, in chat, the whole lot. In fact, I think we worked out that they were actually posting nearly once or chatting at least once every minute, some of the members of these teams, through the day. It's nearly hard to believe that you could work that way. But nevertheless, that was probably our most dominant sort of use, was when the team had to monitor whether it was surveillance of security or whether it was, sort of usage of social media. I don't know what they were actually, but if you have a team that's monitoring something around the clock, around the globe, that's a very high productive use case. The second one was where organisations, and most large organisations do this now, have offshored some of their work. And increasingly, that offshoring isn't just menial work, it's actually just working around the clock type work. And what we found or discovered was that a lot of the resources of these organisations, let's say they were a US organisation and they had some offshore people in Asia, a lot of those people in the offshore didn't have access to the same resources that the people onshore had. So in fact, they had to develop this sort of team where they shared what was happening. They could share what was happening onshore with the people offshore and so forth. And that became quite a common use case and very well use of Teams as well. Global change programs, so if you're rolling out anything, and of course Teams is an example of that, or Office 365, but they could be anything. It could be, we're changing our business model or what have you. Any sort of activity that has to reach to the organisation, has to implement things and do things, not just share information. These change programs, we're heavy users of Teams and using it well. For some of the smaller organisations in our benchmark, we found that, and especially the ones that were project oriented, they were starting to use projects where they could have their clients working together with them, so that both the client and themselves, the service provider, could actually extend the sort of impact or the knowledge that was required out into their respective organisations. So the service provider could sort of ask for support from their organisation outside the team, and by the same token, the client could actually bring people from outside the local team in if and when they needed to. So that became a very productive thing. Now, unfortunately, what we find is with the bigger organisations, they'll often block the external team access. So we think that's a bad thing. We can understand why that happens, but I think the quicker we can move to this internal-external sort of shared environment, the better we'll all be. But I guess the other common thing was that these were all necessarily virtual. You couldn't do this in the office right now. The stunning thing is that as we move into COVID, this is the case for everybody. Certainly in the April-May period, and probably for most of you, it's still the case. You are necessarily virtual. So in essence, you are in the sweet spot, even if you didn't want to be. Now, the other thing we did was, as I said, we typically publish case studies, certainly with our Yammer reports. We really didn't have time to do that with Teams because it takes some time to get case studies approved and so forth. But so we tried to do something different. We said, well, we have a lot of partners, and some of them are listed below on this slide, that actually work with clients in implementing things like Teams and Yammer and what have you. Why don't we sort of engage with them and ask them what they found was not the best practices, but the worst things that they'd seen. So what were the things that they saw that organisations were doing that if they continued to do, that there were going to be bad consequences at the end. And I guess this is a bit of a spin on best practices. I think often when you publish best practices, they sound a little bit like motherhood. But when you publish worst practices, obviously the best practices are obvious because you just do the opposite. So we thought they would gauge more, and it has happened. I mean, people love this approach. So let me just step through those very quickly. Over formalising and over structuring the Teams rollout, and we're actually seeing this in even now, even though the accelerated adoption of Teams is a requirement. We're seeing that we're only going to turn on chat and calls or something like that, or we're not going to turn on this and we're not going to turn on that. This is a typical IT rollout structure, right? So, or we're only going to turn it on to certain people and what have you. So our consultants felt this was a bad thing. They said, look, really Teams isn't like SAP or some ERP sort of thing where you have to roll it out carefully. You really should let everybody use the full functionality and learn how they decide to use it, and then start to reinforce things that are working well and obviously dampen things that aren't working well, and start to use it in a more organic way. The second one was that, again, it is IT team related, but in essence, to be fair to the IT teams, if the business doesn't put their hand up to say, we want to lead the way, we're going to use this software, it falls to the IT department to tell people how they should be using it. And frankly, they're not always the best people to sort of go to for that advice, and that's what our consultants are sort of saying. The third thing, replicating the status quo in teams. I think this is what most people are doing. They're sort of saying, well, we have a team in our structure, so we'll just create a digital team equivalent of that. And that sort of makes sense in a lot of ways, but what we find is that what you call a team in your formal structure often isn't really a team. You know, I was just a story about a lady I met in the gym, and she was talking to me about her woeful experience at working from home because she's a supervisor, and she says, well, we're all on teams, but the staff just don't seem to interact with me like if I was in the office and stuff like that. I'm quite frustrated. I'm working long hours, all this sort of stuff. And then when I talked to her a little bit longer, I said, well, do your team talk to each other? And she said, well, not really. They just do what they have to do. They can just do their own work as individuals. And I said, well, are they really a team then? And she said, well, I guess we call them a team because they're my team, but they actually work independently and they don't even need me really. I just the attachment to the hierarchy. So in essence, what we call a team in the formal hierarchy isn't what we'd call a real team, and certainly not what the researchers tell us are a real team. So, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. The next one was relying on the senior executive to lead the change. Now, clearly with COVID, the senior executive have led the adoption of teams because they really don't have a choice. They need some way of digitally communicating. But in essence, our consultants say this is a bottom-up thing. The way to adopt something like Teams and Yammer for that matter. Well, not so much for Yammer because Yammer does benefit from senior executives sort of posting in the space. But with Teams, they saw that was very much a bottom-up thing. People should just use it, understand what works, and then share what they're doing that's working well. And the final point is the one I call the Thermomix argument. If those of you that are cooks and I happen to have one of these machines, the Thermomix is sold to you. It's a food processor, if you like, but the idea is that it can do all the other tools. You can throw out all of your other, other kitchen tools and just use this one thing that does everything. A number of organisations are adopting this and saying, now that we've got Teams, we don't need Yammer, we don't need SharePoint, we don't need OneNote, everything will just happen in this one tool. No, that's not what it is. In fact, that's not even what Microsoft is suggesting. Of course, they're saying it's a hub. It's a hub where you bring these other richer tools in. But nevertheless, there's certainly quite a number of people that were prepared to turn off other software and just use Teams. So, so those were the top 5. But of course, there was many more in the report. Also, very quickly, I want to talk about cultural modelling because this is something we've done for Teams and Yammer, and this is a very deep topic, so I can't really talk to it in any depth. But I think, in summary, what I would say is that this is the red and the blue. This is cultural mapping of how Teams is being used and how Yammer is being used across 5 organisations that we had using both tools at the time. Now, I guess the summary is that we could say is that we found that basically Yammer does connect more broadly, and Teams very much is very local. That Yammer is very much used for more innovative sort of agile type things. Teams is very much there to do your day-to-day work. Now, this might sound obvious, but when you see it in real data, you can see that this is actually what's happening. And in essence, from a cultural aspect, and this is a concept that John Cotter from Harvard came up with about 6 or 7 years ago, I think now. He said he's a cultural guru. He said, look, there is no one culture. We have to have 2 operating systems, one that was more aligned with the hierarchy, which we see that Teams is sort of happening, and one that's more aligned with the more future agile, future gazing part, which is the network. And we see that Yammer is playing that role. So we see that they're very complementary tools. And if you stop using Yammer, in fact, you will probably stop innovating. The other thing we looked at was collaborative overload. So again, what we do with SWOOP is that we analyze individual personas. So your individual behaviour on Yammer and Teams we'll characterize based on your pattern of interaction. So a broadcaster is somebody who sends a lot out but doesn't get a lot back. A catalyst is somebody who doesn't send that much out but gets a lot back. So that's like an influencer in social media. A responder is someone we call the caregivers of the community. Those are people that respond a lot. They're people that like, they comment, they want to make sure that people feel like they're engaged. The engagers themselves actually do both. They can be catalysts and responders at the same time. And that's our aspirational persona. So, and as you can see, when we look at the teams data over 3 months, you know, the most active people were actually engagers and responders. You can see this dot up the top, which was a broadcaster, which is the most active. In fact, it's very easy to be an active broadcaster, if you like. So the overload risk is really with the responders and the engagers, you know, because these are the people that are actually interacting in a reciprocated way, you know, at scale. So we could see from this who the overload risks were. Yet, as I said, a highly active broadcaster is not overloaded at all because all they're doing is sending stuff out. Now, this part I think is an important part for us. What we discovered with Teams is that people didn't just use them what we traditionally call a team. Right? So we actually analysed interaction patterns, and we used some statistical techniques to identify in fact, there was 5 different types of group usage in Teams. And we classified those as teams. You can see the little icons on the right that are like single leader teams, teams that are more like self-directed behaviours because they connect with each other a lot, forums which are like a single leader team, but a lot of people just watching, you know, inactive people, if you like. And communities are a little bit like a self-directed team as a core, but again, with a lot of people looking to learn from that core. And you can see the breakups here. So even though there was just under 40% that were active, the 5th one was disconnected, which really are inactive teams or fairly inactive. So there's not many relationships there at all. Now, clearly what we want teams to be used is to be as a team. Forums and communities, I think, you know, there can be reasons for having those on Teams, but largely they're the domain of Yammer, we believe. But I'll talk a little bit about how that's evolved over time. Now, in terms of what good looks like, and that's largely what our benchmarking is about. We went to the academic literature to find out what was good and what the academics felt was good, and we aligned our measures to those. So this particular team I'm looking at here, you know, it's highly interactive. So for every post, there's lots and lots of replies and likes. You can see the network map. They're highly interconnected. So very much like a self-directed team, so self-managing team. That was their behaviour. That's not to say they didn't have a formal leader, but their behaviour was like a self-directed team. They knew who the real team was, right? So a lot of teams are called teams, but you know, when you're on the digital space, you can tell who's actually interacting and who's not. And on that little widget, you know, it would say, well, you know, 1% or 2% or 3 people are not active at all. Well, are they really in the team if they're not active? They're responsive, as I said, big response rate to posts. They reciprocate. We have a 2-way measure where if I post, you reply, you post, I reply. We have this sort of reciprocated relationship. We're inclusive. We mention each other. We're diverse because we actually are members of more than one team, so we can bring the experience of those other teams back to this team. We're stable, so there's a core of people that are continually interacting. So these were sort of elements of what a good team looks like. So we can monitor that over time. And as we went into the COVID period, we could start to look at what those teams, both in Yammer and Teams, would look like as people went into the COVID period. We did this analysis in about April, around Easter time. And what we found was that at Easter, which is sort of early April, you know, there'd been a 210% increase in activity in the teams we were monitoring, and about a 70% increase in activity in Yammer. But the interesting thing is that the engagement with new people coming into teams, those measures on the right-hand side, you can't see them very well, they relate to engagement and innovation. And in fact, what we found was in teams, the actual level dropped because new people coming in really didn't know how to engage or how to innovate in that platform. So it just wasn't, you know, the actual innovation engagement levels overall were dropping. Whereas in in Yammer, that didn't happen so much. And as you'd find, there is one measure there called curiosity, which we measure based on how much questioning is happening. In Yammer, that exploded. So clearly Yammer was the platform for this March period where people just weren't sure of what was going on. Then we looked at the sentiment, and we run sentiment for Yammer and Teams, but we had more data for Yammer. So we looked at a number of organisations running sentiment. And what we found was that clearly in that, as I said, in that March period, much more activity. Then coming back to work from home, settling in from May on, it started to flatten out a bit. But looking at the sentiment, we found that largely the sentiment was positive. Right? It was positive during and sustained to be positive as you work from home. But we did find a few organisations where the actual sentiment was actually dropping. Right? So working from home, actually the sentiment was actually getting more negative. So I guess the message here is that, there was some goodwill during the transition period, but you shouldn't rest on those laurels that people will be happy forever. That doesn't appear to be proving the case, at least for some organisations. The team structures. I talked about the team personas in our report when the data was right at the end of 2019. Self-directed behaviours were actually still the most, but just a bit over forums, single leaders, and then our communities, and then single leaders. Right. So, but then we looked at our most active organisation, and we just looked at them in the period before COVID, and they had actually a higher number of self-directed teams in this organisation. By May, that number had actually gone up to 70%. So in fact, people were becoming more self-sufficient and less reliant on the single leader. As you can see, that's only 11. Well, it's still 11%, but largely the forums and the communities were shutting down, if you like, and they were concentrating more on teamwork, which I think was a good thing for us. So let me just go back to that. So I think the thing to take away from this whole movement through COVID was that in terms of teams, we were worried when we did our initial benchmarking that people were using Teams for anything, right? So there was just nearly as many people using it as a community platform, as a forum, as they were using it for what we would call real teamwork. And the research tells us that teams that are bigger than 10 people, any number above that, the productivity drops off, right? So also Jeff Bezos from Amazon famously said that if you couldn't feed a team with 2 pizzas, they were too big. So in essence, what we were despairing when we did our initial benchmarking report was that there were, the average number of people in teams was around 20, 22, 23, even though the number of active members was still around that 10 number. There was a lot more people. There's a lot of team bloat, if you like, and you might think about that when you look at your digital teams. Do you have too many people in them? Are they all actually contributing? Do they all need to be there? So I think the news from what we're seeing with what COVID has done is it's actually pushing us in the right direction. It's pushing us into a situation where sort of leaders in particular have to let people do some of their own stuff and at least behave in a self-directed way. That's not to say the leader's not accountable anymore, but it means that people are actually interacting more on their own accord rather than waiting for the direction of the leader. So as you can see, with this organisation, only 11% of teams we saw were of that nature, which is, and if you think back into your formal organisation, you'd nearly say by default, if you're in a hierarchy, all the teams are a single leader led. You're always going to have a boss somewhere in the hierarchy. But in the digital space, that doesn't have to be. So I think this is where digital is changing significantly the way we work. And I think the biggest impact is actually on the leaders. The leaders who have always been able to lead from in the office have to find a different way of leading, right? They have to be the servant leader that a lot of the consultants and academics have been talking about for decades. They now have to be that because, the office isn't there. Now, clearly we're going to go back to that space, but at least in some respect. But I think once people have experienced this style of working, and let's face it, the leaders were probably the most reluctant to do this because they found that their jobs had been been changed quite a lot, and the way they work have been changed quite a lot. Now they've experienced it, they won't want to go back to what it was before. At least that's my view. So I just want to spend the last little while of this talk speculating a little bit about what that new normal might look like. Now, there's a lot of talk about what is this new normal. I've certainly given many talks and interviews on that topic. I think the general consensus is that it won't go back to what it was before. And there will be more digital, if you like. So there will be more working from home. There'll be more flexibility. People like flexibility. They won't want to give that up. But, they don't want to stay away from the office forever either. So there'll definitely be people going back to the office, maybe not as often as before. We will be doing work differently, but what won't change is the digitisation of the office. And I think that's just going to go more and more and more. We're going to get more and more digital signals. And we at SWOOP, we live off digital signals. And as I said, the signals that we've been mainly mining have been in the areas we felt were the highest interaction areas, like in Teams, like in Yammer and so forth. Previously, you might have looked at email, and of course, many other organisations do that. What we see is that, and what we've found in our research is that a lot of the emails, internal emails, the to and froing email chats, if you like, are migrating into chat. So we've done this sort of research over a number of years, and we've found that chat is pretty much replacing email in terms of people-to-people interaction inside the organisation. Now, that's not to say your organisation is doing that, but clearly that's a trend, and it's certainly a recommendation, because once you get into that chat, and as we've found, the discussions can be much more seamless in chat than they can be in email. But email still has a role, and I'll talk a little bit about that in the next few slides. The concept that I'd seen when I'm looking at the sort of measures that the industry is doing around the digital office, and I started to think about this concept of what are we actually measuring? Because then in SWOOP, we measure relationships, and we see that it's through relationships that knowledge flows. So the tacit knowledge sharing happens through a connection. So we have been concentrating on flows within the Teams and Yammer and workplace environments. But nevertheless, we are reporting on things like chat. We're reporting on, and we're designing some things now to include that into our dashboard, and also into meetings, and to capture calls and things like that. Things that are measured now in Microsoft dashboards. You can see, at least in an aggregate way, what they are. So, and these are things that I would call stock measures. So they're measures of how much we have of something. All right, so that's the stock. So in the knowledge management sort of world, this is the world that I came from early on. I still practice in that discipline. I'm more interested in the tacit knowledge sharing than the explicit, the information sort of stuff. But nevertheless, we always talked about how we measure knowledge as stocks and flows, and we tended to not measure the flows. If you only measured the stocks, you weren't getting the full picture of how you were creating knowledge to develop productive action. So these stocks, and this is a chart that I pulled off, anybody who's an administrator on Teams can get, and it will show you, how much you're doing chat, how many meetings, how many calls, how many channel threaded discussions who've having them. This is a typical stock measure, right? It's how much activity in each channel you are having, right? And Microsoft reports that very well, and and we're actually using some of that data to report through to in our dashboards. This is another newer sort of measure by Microsoft. They're calling their productivity score. But then if you look at that, they're measuring how many chats and discussions you had, how many documents were jointly authored, how many meetings were attended, how many applications were used in the hub. These are stock measures, right? How many of, right? So workplace analytics within Microsoft, very much focused on time. Where do I spend my time? How much time do I spend in individual work versus how much time do I spend in meetings or collaborating with other people? What time of the day do I spend most time doing my email or having meetings and what have you? So time as a resource, it's a stock as well. How am I using that resource, that time? When we think about flows, and just think about workflow, if you like, products don't happen just from stocks, right? It's the flow between the stocks that's important. And if we don't measure how work is flowing and we're only measuring stocks, are we able to really track whether the organisation's getting true benefit from using these digital tools? So that's the question that I was mulling around, and whilst we do measure flows or connections within the high intensity areas of team discussions and Yammer discussions and so forth, organisations are using all of these different channels and signals. So how do we look at the flows across this broader sort of world? So looking at flows, I was inspired when I started looking at this diagram. And this is a diagram of energy consumption in the US. It's a representation called the Sankey diagram that Laurence laboratories sort of develop every so often, I think annually. And I've got interest in renewable energy and so forth. So I was obviously looking at the renewable energy flows, which is, which we want to get bigger. In the US, they're pretty small when you look at this map, and you can see where they're flowing into how they're used, either industrially, where petroleum's being used and so forth. So this is flow, right? This is energy flow. The other thing of note is this, that I didn't appreciate, was this rejected energy. So this is sort of energy that wasn't actually used, so when I sat back and looked at this and thought, well, what happened if we were able to measure like the energy of people? Think about your own energy and where you're putting it within the different sort of channels that you're communicating. What about your knowledge flows, your tacit knowledge flows? Where do they flow through to a productive output? Or in fact, there's a lot of knowledge lost, or the opportunity lost when say an opportunity comes through and somebody decides not to work with others on it and just tries to do their own thing, and nothing happens. So we're all being involved in innovation programs or things like that where they just died or what have you. We didn't get a productive outcome. So no doubt that energy loss or that knowledge loss is something that we need to know about. Right? So this is really hot off the press stuff. In fact, I've only been working on it the last week because I've been drawing myself back to think about this bigger picture of flow. So I came up with this. This is sort of my view of the digital office knowledge flows. And on the left, you have, if you like, some common sources of knowledge that trigger a flow. So meetings are a big one. We hear a lot about Zoom meetings and being overrun by meetings and so forth, digital meeting. Email, for example, especially for external sort of use, so things coming from the outside world, whether they're notifications of content or whether they're customers or suppliers or partners that are coming through, that's a trigger for knowledge flows. And of course, your town hall meetings where the executive get up to tell you what the state of the nation and where you're heading and so forth, mainly informational. What happens with knowledge that's flowing from those sources? Now, this is obviously incomplete and it's abstracted, but bear with me. Some of it could be just solo work, for example, like I hear this, I've got an action from a meeting, I just go and do stuff on my own. So I'm an individual contributor that doesn't have to interact with anybody. The chances are that as a solo worker, you might be able to develop some outcomes, but largely the opportunity to do more with your work is lost if you don't collaborate. And I think people can accept that. You could, as in teams, just chat with people and call people, and you see up the top right-hand corner, we've got chat and calls. So you're collaborating to an extent. But if you look at your chat history and look at your call history and look at how many people were involved, so just as an exercise, you might want to look at the chat part of your teams. How many times was the chat including more than one other person? How many times were your calls involving more than one other person? So clearly when you're doing chat and calls, you've really got a small group of people, probably only one other that you're interacting with. And that's not a bad thing in a sense, because that's what you need to do to get a real deep knowledge sharing happening. So if you're going to do something complex, you really do need to do that one-on-one sort of stuff. But if you do it in isolation, then the impact's likely to be less than it could be. So you're going to have sort of, and of course, then you've got some knowledge flows that can go through to the community, if you like, and that's where you can get a broader sort of engagement with the whole enterprise. Some of that knowledge might flow through to a team, which might be a team that's actually executing on some of the things that are flowing out of the community. In executing their actions, the team, they might start doing chats from the team, not the whole team, but just 1 or 2 people might break out into a channel, do some group chat, do some calls. And of course, I would sort of say, and I'm showing this in the next version of this, is how you might use this. Think about the green flows as flows that you're actually engaging more people, so it's more collaborative. But there is a sort of a flow that, if you like, the frequency of interaction goes up. And we can see this in the data. The number of interactions that happen on Yammer is less than what happens on team channels, which is less than what happens in group chat. There isn't as many calls, if you like, than as chat in messages, but they're much more intense because that's like a face-to-face nearly. So the intensity is higher, if you like. So you can see that if the knowledge flows through there, that you're more than likely going to get more innovation and productive outcome than if you took the red path, where you're pretty much doing either solo work or just having short, small discussions with your colleagues. So this is a concept we want to take forward, because we think that we can measure some of these flows. The stocks we can measure because we know we've got that now. We can measure how many chats, how many team discussions, how many Yammer discussions, how many emails, how many meetings we had. What we can't measure is these flows. So I want to end there. I think my time's up anyway. SWOOP, we are a sponsor, so we do have a couple more talks. We had one yesterday on what a high performance team looks like, and you can see the recording of that. I forget the number on that, but that was Kai Kerr, my co-founder. And but 2 to come: how to measure success in the new world of remote work. A little bit of stuff that I've talked about, but taken further, and also another presentation in more depth on the benchmarking results that I'd sort of gave you a summary of here. So if you want to learn more of that, go and listen to those talks or look at the recordings and so forth. And finally, this is our sponsor slide. There's a impressive number of sponsors there, of course, and we're sitting there in the middle as SWOOP Analytics. Go to our website. There's a lot of content in there. We share a lot. So and you can trial, of course. Free trials are available for Yammer and Teams. If you're in the Microsoft space, and I assume this audience is Microsoft, so and in fact we benchmark, so you can actually very quickly, even if you're just trialing, you can see how you compare with everybody else that's used SWOOP over the last 6 years. So thank you for your attention, and I think my time's up.
Thank you so much, Laurence. We'd like to invite you to join Laurence at the post-session networking. I've posted the link in the chat window, and we'd like to say just enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.